Eric's eyes opened to darkness. His breath came ragged, sharp, pulling in air that felt alien, metallic, as though it had been strangled by something unnatural. His muscles coiled, instinct taking over. He pushed against the cold metal cocoon around him, his fingers brushing frost and slick, alien steel. A guttural growl rose from his chest. The last thing he remembered was the roar of waves against the longship, the thunder of war drums, and the clash of swords. He had been leading his clan into battle, an enemy worthy of his blade, and then, nothing. Now, he was here, wherever here was. A faint hum filled the silence. The walls of his confinement glowed faintly blue, lines of light running in patterns he couldn't comprehend. The frost began to melt, dripping onto his skin, and with a final heave, he shattered the barrier. He fell forward, hitting the ground hard, but his body was already moving, adrenaline surging as he scanned his surroundings. The chamber was vast and sterile, the walls smooth and pulsating faintly with the same blue light. Alien figures stood frozen in shock, tall, insectoid creatures encased in dark, gleaming armor, their segmented limbs twitching as if deciding whether to flee or fight. Eric's gaze narrowed, his instincts screaming danger. One of them barked a series of sharp clicks and whistles, raising a weapon that looked like a spear but glowed with energy at its tip. Eric didn't wait. He lunged forward, his hands finding a shard of his broken prison. It wasn't a blade, but it would do. The alien fired, the energy bolt seared past his head, close enough to singe his hair. He closed the gap in 2 strides and drove the shard into the creature's neck. The alien staggered, gurgling as it collapsed. The others reacted too late. Eric grabbed the fallen weapon, its strange weight foreign in his hands, but his body moved on instinct. He spun it like an axe, cleaving through the next foe with brutal precision. Blood, black and viscous, splattered across his face, and a feral grin split his lips. This was a battlefield. This was where he belonged. The last alien fled, its panicked screeches echoing down the corridors. Eric didn't chase. He needed answers. His breathing slowed as he surveyed the room, noting the strange, glowing symbols etched onto consoles and walls. None of it made sense, but one thing was clear, this was no mortal realm. Was he dead? Valhalla should be filled with warriors, not strange machines and alien beasts. "Who has brought me here?" he bellowed, his voice booming in the silence. "Show yourself, coward." The only response was a faint vibration under his feet, a low rumble that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He gripped the alien weapon tighter, his knuckles whitening. Then he heard it, a voice, not spoken but inside his head, cold and mechanical. Subject 45080 awakened. Containment breach. Eric spun, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The voice continued, calm and emotionless. Engage subdual protocols. Deploy suppression units. The hum grew louder, and from the far end of the room, a section of the wall slid open. Figures stepped through, tall, humanoid shapes made of metal, their glowing red eyes locking onto Eric. They moved in unison, their steps heavy, deliberate. Eric snarled, brandishing the alien spear. "You'll not take me without a fight." The machines advanced, their arms morphing into weapons that began to glow ominously. Eric didn't wait for them to fire. He charged, the spear singing through the air as it connected with the first machine's head, sparks flying as the blow dented the metal. The second aimed a blast at him, but he rolled, the energy bolt scorching the ground where he'd stood. The fight was chaos, steel against alien energy, brute force against cold precision. Eric's body moved with the fluidity of years on the battlefield, his strikes deliberate and devastating. He tore a limb from one of the machines, using it as a bludgeon against the others. They were strong, but they were predictable. He was not. One by one, they fell, their glowing eyes dimming as their bodies crumpled. Eric stood amidst the wreckage, panting, his hands slick with black fluid and oil. He leaned on the spear, his body aching but alive. From the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. A human, no, not quite human, emerged from the shadows. She was clad in rags but had strange, glowing circuitry embedded in her skin, her eyes a haunting mix of fear and awe. "You're human," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric turned to face her fully, his expression hard. "What manner of sorcery is this? Speak quickly." She flinched but held her ground. This is Earth. What's left of it? They took everything. The Zalorans. They enslaved us, turned our planet into a mining outpost. I don't know how you're here, but you shouldn't be. They'll come for you." "Let them come," Eric growled. "I'll send them to hell." The woman's eyes widened. "You don't understand. They have an army. Machines, weapons you can't even imagine. You can't fight them alone." Eric's gaze softened, just slightly. "Alone? No. But my people once stood against armies. We knew what it meant to fight, to bleed, to die for something greater. Where are your warriors?" She looked away, shame coloring her features. We gave up. Most of us. Those who resist are scattered, hiding. It's hopeless." Eric stepped closer, his towering presence both intimidating and commanding. "Hopeless? The only time a fight is hopeless is when the blade falls from your hand. Gather your people. Tell them their fight is not over." She hesitated, her lips trembling. Who are you?" He stood tall, his bloodied spear resting on his shoulder, his voice steady and fierce. "I am Eric Bjornsson, chieftain of the Bjorn clan. And I will remind these Zalorans why men once feared the wrath of Vikings." For a moment, the woman stared at him, disbelief warring with a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Then she nodded. "There's a resistance cell not far from here. If you're serious about fighting, I can take you to them." Eric nodded. "Lead the way." As they moved through the corridors, the faint echoes of approaching forces grew louder. Eric tightened his grip on the spear, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, unyielding determination. He didn't understand this world or the creatures that ruled it, but one thing was clear: he had been called to battle once more, and the fires of war burned hotter than ever in his veins. This was no Valhalla. But it would do. The resistance camp was hidden deep beneath the ruins of an ancient city, its labyrinthine tunnels winding through the bones of Earth's forgotten history. Eric followed the woman, whose name he now knew to be Lila, through the narrow passageways. Her movements were quick, cautious, her eyes darting to every shadow. Eric's steps were slower, deliberate. His instincts, honed by countless battles, told him danger lurked everywhere. "Stay close," Lila whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Zaloran patrols sweep these tunnels regularly." Eric grunted in acknowledgement, his hand tightening around the spear he'd claimed. It felt alien, wrong, but it was sharp, and sharp things were always useful. As they rounded a corner, a faint glow illuminated the darkness ahead. Voices reached them, low, murmured, tinged with weariness. "This is it," Lila said, gesturing to a rusted metal door. She knocked in a complex rhythm, and after a tense pause, it creaked open to reveal a man with a scarred face and a distrustful gaze. "Lila," the man said, his voice rough. "Who's this?" "A reinforcement," Lila replied, stepping inside. Eric followed, ducking slightly to clear the doorway. The man's eyes widened as he took in Eric's towering frame, the blood-slicked armor he'd scavenged from fallen foes, and the feral intensity in his gaze. "Reinforcement," the man repeated, incredulous. "What are you talking about? And where did he get that weapon?" "It's a long story, Marcus," Lila said quickly. "But he's here to help. Trust me." Marcus snorted. "Trust you? We barely trust each other as it is. And now you bring some relic into our hideout? What's next, Lila? A Zaloran peace treaty?" Eric stepped forward, his shadow falling over Marcus. "Enough," he said, his voice a low rumble. "If you have no stomach for fighting, step aside. Those who cower behind walls have no place questioning warriors." Marcus bristled but said nothing. Lila shot Eric a warning look, but he ignored it, his focus already shifting to the room beyond. The resistance fighters gathered there were a ragged bunch, thin, tired, their faces lined with despair. They looked up as Eric entered, their conversations falling silent. Lila cleared her throat. "Everyone, this is Eric. He's from before. Before the Zalarans, before everything. He's a fighter, and he's here to help us." Silence hung heavy in the air. Finally, an older woman with gray-streaked hair spoke, her voice tinged with skepticism. "From before? What does that even mean?" Eric stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the group. "It means I've fought battles you cannot imagine. It means I've faced enemies who would freeze your blood with a glance and bled on fields where the earth turned to mud beneath our feet. And it means I've won." He held up the alien spear. "Your enemies are not invincible. I have tasted their blood. They die like anything else." The room remained silent, the fighters exchanging uncertain glances. Marcus scoffed. "Great speech. But words don't win wars." Eric's gaze snapped to Marcus. "No. Actions do. Tell me, Marcus, how many of your people have fallen because you waited for words instead of wielding blades?" Marcus took a step back, his face flushing with anger and shame. Lila stepped between them, raising her hands. "Enough. We don't have time for this. The Zalarans are planning something big, and if we don't act now, it won't matter who's right." "What do you mean?" the older woman asked. Lila hesitated. "I overheard a patrol talking about a new subjugation device. It's almost operational. If they activate it, it'll wipe out any remaining resistance cells, us included." A murmur of fear rippled through the group. Eric's expression darkened. "Where is this device?" Lila hesitated. "It's heavily guarded. Deep within the central tower." "Then that's where we'll go," Eric said simply. Marcus laughed bitterly. "Just like that? March into the most fortified structure on the planet and destroy their most advanced weapon? You're insane." "No," Eric said, stepping closer. "I'm a warrior. If you're too weak to fight, then stay here and wait for death." "But I won't." Lila looked at Marcus, then at the others. "We've done nothing but hide and run for years. Eric's right. If we don't fight now, when will we?" The room fell silent again, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Finally, the older woman stood. "I'm in." One by one, others rose, their hesitation giving way to grim determination. Marcus scowled but didn't argue. Eric nodded approvingly. "Good. Gather your weapons and prepare yourselves. Tonight, we remind these invaders that Earth is not theirs to claim." The plan came together quickly, born of desperation and necessity. Eric studied the maps and schematics Lila provided, his sharp mind quickly piecing together a strategy. "We strike hard and fast," he said. "No time for stealth. Confusion will be our ally." As the fighters armed themselves with scavenged weapons and explosives, Eric walked among them, offering quiet words of encouragement. They were not warriors, most had never held a weapon before, but they had fire in their eyes, and that was enough. When the time came, Eric led the charge. The resistance fighters surged through the tunnels, their fear overridden by adrenaline. Eric's spear was a blur, slicing through Zalaran patrols with brutal efficiency. His battle cries echoed through the corridors, a primal sound that sent chills down the spines of friend and foe alike. As they approached the central tower, resistance stiffened. The Zalarans were waiting, their ranks bolstered by towering war machines. Eric didn't hesitate. "Hold the line," he roared, plunging into the fray. The battle was chaos. Energy bolts lit the darkness, explosions rocked the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of blood and burning metal. Eric fought like a demon, his movements a blend of raw strength and calculated precision. Around him, the resistance held their ground, inspired by his example. Finally, they breached the tower's defenses. Eric led a small team inside, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous halls. The subjugation device loomed ahead, a massive, pulsating machine that seemed to hum with malevolent energy. There! Lila shouted. That's it. Eric didn't hesitate. He charged the machine, his spear raised high. The Zalarans guarding it turned to fire, but Eric was faster. He slammed into the first, driving his weapon through its chest, then spun to disarm the second. The others opened fire, but Lila and the others provided cover, their weapons blazing. Reaching the device, Eric plunged his spear into its core. Sparks flew, and the machine began to shudder violently. Fall back, he bellowed, pulling Lila and the others toward the exit. Behind them, the device erupted in a blinding explosion, the shockwave sending them tumbling to the ground. When the dust settled, Eric rose slowly, his body battered but unbroken. Around him, the resistance fighters began to cheer, their voices rising in triumph. Eric allowed himself a small smile. This was only the beginning. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Eric stood at the base of the Zalaran tower, his breath steady despite the chaos around him. The resistance fighters, though battered and weary, had a fire in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Victory, however fleeting, had rekindled a spark they thought long extinguished. "We've struck a blow," Eric said, his voice cutting through the din of murmured conversations. "But it's not enough. The Zalarans will regroup. Their pride demands it. They'll retaliate," Marcus said, his tone grim as he leaned against a broken wall. "And with more force than we can handle." "Let them," Eric growled, gripping his alien spear tighter. "If they come, we'll be ready. Fear is a weapon. Today, we've shown them it's not theirs to wield." Lila approached, her face smudged with soot but her expression resolute. "The destruction of their subjugation device will set them back, but it won't stop them. They have fleets, armies, resources we can't begin to match." "We don't need to match them," Eric replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We only need to remind them that we won't kneel." A sharp sound echoed through the air, a high-pitched hum that grew louder with each passing second. Lila's eyes widened. "They're here." Above them, the sky split open as Zalaran dropships descended like predatory birds. The sleek, obsidian vessels bristled with weapons, their engines roaring as they hovered ominously over the ruined battlefield. From their bellies, waves of soldiers poured out, gleaming armor reflecting the fires below, their weapons humming with deadly energy. The resistance fighters froze, their earlier triumph evaporating as the sheer scale of the enemy's response became clear. Eric stepped forward, placing himself between the advancing Zalarans and his people. "Hold the line," he commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "Fear will not save you. Steel and fire will." The fighters hesitated, then began to move, forming a ragged line behind him. Marcus barked orders, rallying the others as best he could. Lila crouched beside Eric, her makeshift rifle trembling in her hands. "We can't win this," she said quietly, her voice laced with both fear and determination. "Victory isn't always survival," Eric replied, his eyes never leaving the approaching enemy. "Sometimes it's teaching your foe that the cost of conquering you is too great." The Zalaran forces surged forward, their formation precise, their weapons blazing. Eric charged to meet them, his battle cry a primal roar that sent chills through friend and foe alike. The first wave of aliens faltered under his assault, their ranks breaking as his spear tore through them with brutal efficiency. Around him, the resistance fought with newfound ferocity, inspired by the sight of the unrelenting Viking carving a path through their oppressors. A massive Zalaran warrior stepped forward, towering even over Eric. Its armor gleamed like polished obsidian, and its weapon, a double-bladed energy axe, hummed with lethal intent. It regarded Eric with a cold, calculating gaze before speaking in a guttural, mechanical voice. "Primitive. You will fall like the rest of your kind." Eric grinned, his bloody teeth bared like a wolf preparing for the kill. "Come, then. Show me the strength of your kind." The Zalaran swung its axe with terrifying speed, the blade slicing through the air with a deadly hum. Eric sidestepped, his movements fluid despite the weight of his armor, and countered with a swift thrust of his spear. The alien parried, the clash of their weapons sparking violently. The battle between them was brutal, each strike shaking the ground beneath their feet. Eric fought with a wild, unpredictable fury, his attacks relentless. The Zalaran relied on precision and brute strength, but it quickly became clear that it was unprepared for an opponent like Eric. His movements were chaotic, his strikes calculated to exploit every weakness he could find. Around them, the resistance was holding their ground, though barely. Lila fired shot after shot, her hands steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Marcus led a group in a desperate flanking maneuver, their makeshift explosives wreaking havoc on the enemy's ranks. Eric and the Zalaran clashed again, their weapons locking as they pushed against each other. The alien's glowing red eyes burned with frustration. "You cannot win. Your defiance is meaningless." Eric's grin widened. "And yet, here I stand." With a sudden burst of strength, he broke the lock, spinning his spear and driving it into the alien's side. The Zalaran staggered, black blood oozing from the wound, but it wasn't finished. It swung wildly, the axe narrowly missing Eric's head as he ducked and retaliated with a vicious upward strike. The spear pierced through the alien's chest, the glowing tip emerging from its back. The Zalaran collapsed, its body hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Eric ripped his spear free, breathing heavily as he turned to face the next wave. But the battlefield had changed. The resistance fighters, emboldened by his victory, were pressing forward, their desperate fight transforming into a relentless assault. A sudden explosion rocked the battlefield, a Zalaran dropship erupting in flames as Marcus's team managed to breach its hull. The remaining ships began to retreat, their forces faltering under the unexpected resistance. As the last of the Zalarans fled, a weary silence fell over the battlefield. The resistance fighters looked around, stunned by their survival. Eric stood in the center of the carnage, his spear resting against his shoulder, his gaze sweeping over the broken enemy forces. Lila approached him, her rifle hanging limply at her side. We did it," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. Eric nodded. "Today, we showed them our strength. But this is only the beginning. They will return, stronger, angrier. We must be ready." Marcus limped over, his expression a mix of exhaustion and grudging respect. "You're a madman, Eric. But you might just be the madman we need." Eric chuckled, the sound deep and rough. "Then let us prepare for the next battle. The gods are watching, and they favor the bold." As the resistance began to regroup, tending to their wounded and fortifying their defenses, Eric stood apart, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He could feel it in his bones, this was far from over. The Zalarans would return, but so would he, ready to meet them with fire and fury. For now, though, they had won. And in a world where victory was a rare and precious thing, that was enough. The fires still burned in the distance, casting an eerie glow across the jagged remnants of the battlefield. Eric stood atop a crumbled wall, his spear planted firmly in the ground beside him, its tip glistening with the black blood of his enemies. The resistance fighters moved below him, their voices low, heavy with exhaustion and the weight of survival. Eric watched in silence, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He had seen too many battlefields to let a single victory bring him comfort. Lila approached, her face pale under the grime and soot that clung to her skin. Her eyes were sharp, though, burning with a determination Eric hadn't seen when they first met. "We've scavenged what we could from the Zalaran dropships. Ammunition, medical supplies, a few pieces of tech. It's not much, but it'll help." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "It's a start." She hesitated, then stepped closer, her voice dropping. "They'll be back, won't they? This was just a test, wasn't it? To see how far we'd go." Eric finally turned to her, his eyes cold but not unkind. "They'll come with more ships, more soldiers, more weapons. They'll want to crush the hope we've kindled here before it spreads. That's their way." Lila exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping. "Then what's the point? We barely survived this. How do we stop an entire empire?" "You don't stop an empire," Eric said, his voice firm. "You make it bleed. You strike at its heart, its pride, its leaders. You make it question its invincibility. The rest will crumble in time. Marcus joined them, his limp more pronounced now, but his jaw was set. If that's the plan, we'd better get moving. We've got maybe a day before they're back in force, and we're sitting ducks out here. Eric looked down at the resistance fighters, huddled in small groups, their faces lined with exhaustion but also something new, resolve. He pointed toward the charred remains of the largest Zalaran dropship. What's left of their ship? Marcus shrugged. Not much. The explosion gutted it, but the shell's intact. Why? It's a ship, Eric said simply. And a ship can fly. Marcus stared at him, then laughed, a bitter, incredulous sound. You've lost it. That thing's a pile of scrap. Even if we could get it working, we wouldn't know how to fly it. I don't need it to fly, Eric replied, his voice steady. I need it to send a message. The resistance gathered around as Eric laid out his plan. The damaged Zalaran dropship would be repurposed, not as a means of escape but as a weapon. They would overload its core, turning it into a massive explosive, and pilot it directly into the heart of the nearest Zalaran command ship. The attack would be suicidal for the pilot, but Eric didn't flinch as he volunteered for the role. You don't have to do this, Lila said, her voice breaking as she stood beside him. There are other ways. There have to be. Eric shook his head. Your fight is here. Mine is there. The Zalarans won't stop hunting you until they believe you're no threat. I'll make them see otherwise. Lila grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. We need you here. You're the reason we're even still alive. You don't need me, Eric said, his tone softening. You need what I've given you, belief. That doesn't die with me. The hours passed in a flurry of activity. The fighters worked tirelessly to rig the dropship's core, their fear giving way to grim determination. Eric helped where he could, but his focus remained on preparing himself for what lay ahead. He sharpened the edge of his spear, running his thumb along its blade until a thin line of blood appeared. He smiled faintly. It was sharp enough. When the time came, Eric climbed into the dropship's cockpit. The controls were incomprehensible, alien symbols glowing faintly in the dim light, but Lila sat beside him, her fingers flying over a salvage terminal. I've set the course, she said, her voice tight. Once you're close enough, the core will detonate. You'll have a minute to get clear, if you change your mind. I won't, Eric said. He glanced at her, his expression softening. Thank you, Lila. For reminding your people what it means to fight. She swallowed hard, nodding as she stepped back. For what it's worth. I think the gods would be proud of you. He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. The gods are watching, yes. Let's hope they're paying attention. The ship rumbled to life, its engines sputtering before roaring with a deafening roar. The fighters outside shielded their eyes as it lifted off, its battered hull shuddering with the strain. Lila watched until it disappeared into the sky, her fists clenched at her sides. Inside the cockpit, Eric gripped the controls, his eyes fixed on the massive Zalaran command ship looming ahead. Its sleek, obsidian surface bristled with weapons, and its sheer size dwarfed anything he'd seen before. It was a fortress, a testament to the Zalarans' power and arrogance. As the dropship approached, alarms blared throughout the command ship. Zalaran fighters swarmed toward him, their energy weapons lighting up the darkness. Eric maneuvered the ship as best he could, dodging blasts and returning fire with the dropship's remaining cannons. His heart pounded, but his resolve never wavered. The command ship loomed closer, its surface growing larger in his view. Eric could see the faint outlines of windows, the glint of alien figures inside. He imagined their panic, their disbelief that a single human could dare to challenge them so directly. As the ship's core reached critical mass, Eric gripped his spear, standing from the pilot's seat. The cockpit around him shuddered violently, sparks flying as the overloaded systems began to fail. He took a deep breath, his thoughts briefly drifting to his clan, his home, the waves crashing against the shore. To Valhalla, he whispered. The explosion lit up the void of space, a blinding flash that consumed the Zalaran command ship in an instant. Below, on the surface of Earth, the Resistance fighters saw the light and cheered, their voices rising in triumph and sorrow. In the quiet that followed, Lila stood on the ruins of the battlefield, staring up at the sky. Marcus approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "He did it," Marcus said, his voice soft. "He actually did it." Lila nodded, her eyes never leaving the sky. "He reminded them we're not afraid." And as the Resistance fighters began to regroup, their resolve stronger than ever, the story of Erik Bjornsson, the Viking who defied an empire, began to spread, a legend that would inspire countless others to rise and fight. For even in the face of impossible odds, humanity's spirit burned brighter than any star.